Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this panel on harnessing landscapes at scale to maximize carbon returns. My name is Petri Lehtonen, and I'm privileged to moderate these sessions with very, I think, very good panelists. I personally have about 35 years plus experience with working with different forest investments in different parts of the world. And after that, I can say that I'm convinced that we really have to consider landscapes when investing in forests. The landscapes around the forests and around, let's say, forest-based value chains. And currently I'm working with a Forest for the Future facility, which is advising the European Commission international partnerships in future forest interventions. We have here excellent experts to discuss how we can apply landscape approach to help corporate to invest profitably to increase carbon stocks, biodiversity, and generate other products and benefits in the landscapes. And here we have, in addition to me, we have three experts: Paul Chatterton from the Landscape Finance Lab, Charles Karawanga from IUCN in Africa, and Alex Baski from Montana from Flow Carbon. I will let them introduce themselves. So I would like Paul to start. Paul, could you please say a few words?
Thanks very much, Petri, and hello, everyone. It's a real honor to be here. I've been on a few of these conferences, and I really enjoy the discussion. So I lead the Landscape Finance Lab. We were set up by the conservation organization WWF. We span out last year, and our purpose is to help incubate and finance sustainable landscapes around the world. So we're doing that in three ways. We're helping people to build landscape programs. Secondly, we help them get financing for that, but also build finance instruments that work at a landscape scale. And thirdly, learn as we go along, because we're building the plane as we fly. I'm sitting in Vienna, Austria. Back to you, Petri.
Okay, then Charles, it's your turn to say regards from Africa.
Yeah, thank you, Petri, and glad to be here today. Actually, I'm sending greetings from Lilongwe in Malawi, where I'm working from this week. So I work for IUCN, and I'm heading a team that works on land systems. Land systems, the program covers forest, sustainable agriculture, and drylands, and we just really look at across landscape, applying landscape approach within those three sectorial areas. So connecting forest, but linking this with also sustainable agriculture. But then in drylands area, you look at how do you turn around the drylands related degradations, etc. And then our value proposition, we put on the table really to connect the demand and the supply. The demand is when you have an investor who is looking for where to put his money in terms of restoration. We know where those restoration opportunities are, and we can easily be able to put those in the table for investors, from development partners to private investors to any other type of investor who is interested to join the movement. I'm based in Nairobi, and I'm looking forward to this conversation, Petri. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Okay, Alex, now it's your turn. Tell regards from Montana.
Yep, exactly. Based here in very cold Montana, early morning here. Honored to be here, and I'm representing Flow Carbon, and we're a company bringing transparency and efficiency to the voluntary carbon market, along with other ecosystem marketplaces. So very excited to be here. My background is in conservation, mostly wildlife habitat, restoration and protection. and through different land trusts and the Nature Conservancy. And I'm excited to be here with Charles and Paul and Petri to discuss how blockchain technology can bring transparency and therefore trust and higher returns to these kinds of projects at a landscape scale, and support Paul and Charles in their work in creating methodologies that we should all be supporting and the activities on the ground that are creating these kinds of returns and impact. Back to you, Petri.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So I guess now we can really start the discussion, and I would like to address the first question to Paul, who is very experienced with this landscape approach. So what do we actually mean by landscape approach, and what is the, let's say, the comparative advantage or value added compared to conventional sector approach? And is there a common methodology that, for example, corporates could follow? Please, Paul.
Thanks, Petri. I'll have a go at that. There's a big question. So, I mean, first, what's a landscape? That's when we back in 2015, we wrote a book called The Little Sustainable Landscape Book. We brought together 30 different organizations to come to a common definition on what's a landscape, what is the landscape approach, how is it useful. And we did a test on definitions of the landscape approach. We found 80 different definitions of the landscape approach back then, and they weren't that different to each other, but they were all different ways of looking at it. What we have now, I think, is a common understanding through that book and much work since in the last, 7 years. A landscape is simply, this is how we described it in that book, and I think it holds, is simply how people see the landscape. It can be an ecological unit, so like a river basin or a forest system or an ecoregion. It can be an administrative unit, so a province or a district, or it can be a cultural unit. It might be a tribal territory, or it could be somewhere like Tuscany or the Lakes District of the UK, a place that people see as an independent place. So landscape is a fairly simple thing if you look at it that way. The landscape approach is, how do you maximize the benefits for everyone and for nature in that landscape? That's the challenge of the landscape approach. So integrating social, environmental, and economic outcomes to the best advantage. And the good news is there's now a fairly simple methodology for doing that. It's called the 4 returns framework. Let me give you the link for this report, because a lot of work has gone into this. There's, of course, a number of different ways of doing this, but this, I think, is a nice, simple way of thinking about it. 5 steps to build a landscape. So the first step is to bring the stakeholders together in the landscape and reach a common understanding, set a vision for how they want to address a problem in the landscape, get financing and take action, and then measure and learn. So those are the 5 steps. And if you do that, you achieve the 4 returns, which are environmental results, social results, economic results, and hope, inspiration, giving people hope back for their landscape. And importantly, the process balances those 4 results. And a third part of it is to make sure that you balance nature and production. So minimum 3 zones. You can have as many as you like, but an area for nature, an area for production, and an area in between where you're regenerating nature, but you're also doing business and activities to the best possible advantage. And I think that's starting to make sense to people. I'm seeing a lot of money starting to flow into this, a lot of companies talking about it. The question is, how do we really make it work? And I'm really pleased to see that that's a consistent theme through these conferences. Back to you, Petri.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe still just a very quick question to you, Paul. We have Rene Chettle from the audience asking about what type of finance instruments you develop for landscape finance. So just maybe very briefly, I mean, we can return to this later.
Okay, try and do that one short. So we kicked off the Landscape Finance Lab after we'd built what are still some of the largest forest carbon programs in the world, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Indonesia. The Mayandombe program is a 14 million hectare program, $170 million carbon investment. And that taught us an enormous amount. It's a different game when you're thinking that sort of money. You can think long-term, you can build systems, you can create synergies between different actors, and it's no longer about projects. So we set up the lab to think about what sort of instruments we could do like that for carbon, but also with commercial finance. And one of our first experiments was the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility in Jambi. We had a very tiny role in that, but it's $215 million of commercial investment led by Michelin tire company for wildlife-friendly rubber and forest protection and forest restoration and smallholder production. It's quite exciting. It has its challenges, but there's lots of good lessons there, and you're starting to see landscape finance instruments like that coming, commercial ones, but you're also seeing investment vehicles. Moreover, BNP Paribas, many of the big banks are creating these investment vehicles. We helped FMO, the Dutch Development Fund, to set up the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, which is a 160 million euro instrument for 10 landscapes and nature-based solutions in those landscapes. And there's so much more money coming. I had 3 breakfasts in a row one morning in Glasgow last November with 3 sets of bankers, each building $500 million or $1 billion funds for landscapes and nature-based solutions. Hope that helps, Petri.
Okay, thank you. I think that now we would like to hear something from Africa. Charles, you are working with IUCN, and actually I think that it's a priority, very high priority landscape for where we can really have significant impact. So can you give some examples of successful cases in landscape, let's say financing and gaining these carbon returns, biodiversity returns, other benefits? Please, Charles.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. And I think this is a big question. Again, there's quite a number of diversity of investments in different landscapes. But before I go into that, I just wanted to highlight that there's a great political momentum in Africa than ever before to invest in the landscape approach, especially focusing on landscape restoration. In the last couple of years, there have been quite a lot of investment to understand what are the opportunities for restoration in Africa. And IUCN have been doing a lot of work to really dig that question and understand the opportunities. And as we speak, about 800 million hectares on the continent are available for opportunities that at least present opportunities for restoration. And this is not only for agricultural land, it's also for other type of land use. So from forest to agriculture to ranches and farming, pastoralism, communities, etc. And this excited the continent. So it created a political momentum where in Africa, the continent launched what we call FR100, which is basically a Pan-African initiative to restore 100 million by 2030, 100 million hectares of degraded areas. And about 32 countries have already joined that momentum and they committed to restore 128 million already by 2030. So these are political momentum. So there's a whole political will from the Southern Africa to Eastern Africa to Central and West Africa, even the Northern Africa region. And countries like Ethiopia expressed interest to say, we will bring under restoration 18 million hectares by 2030. That's already a huge opportunity. Small country like Rwanda, where I come from, 2 million hectares. This is a border-to-border restoration. And when you go into the details, as you said, Pat, about examples of really live examples of how it's working, you see a number of business cases that are already showing that restoration of landscapes with forest or agroforestry brings return. We just completed a number of scoping on the continent in Southern Africa, actually sub-Saharan Africa region, and we identified about 10 very successful business cases of really things that are happening. And I will mention a couple of them. One of them is the work that is being done in cotton production by Olam in Ghana, for example. Through regenerative agriculture, it's very clear that there is a very significant increase, 80% of increase in production of cocoa by just applying agroforestry and cocoa together, because it increased the soil health, but also biodiversity, etc. Not only that, if you look at, that's for cotton actually. If you look at cocoa, some companies reported a very significant increase, actually up to 80% of increase in production. So these are real business cases. You see that functioning in the landscapes. And I can talk to coffee by Tuton or Nespresso, where actually 200 to 300% increase of production of coffee by just applying regenerative agricultural practices of mixing soil management and agroforestry and restoration. Now, let's go to timber, which is a very big market opportunity on the continent. So you are talking about 400 million hectares available land, bare land, for restoration with the timber species that we can name on the continent. So some countries have already identified this and they are investing in that. And even beyond just timber and these cash crops like coffee or tea, you can even speak to horticulture, vegetable production on the continent. So there's quite a huge opportunity there. If you invest in regenerative, sustainable agricultural mechanism or restoration, forest landscape restoration, it's very clear that you can easily get your return back. So I think we can name a number of cases, even at a very small holder of what we call smallholder forestry schemes, where, for example, in Rwanda, the government has decided to put a lot of efforts in what we call participatory forest management. You have 1 hectare, 2 hectares of forest, people comes together, brings 100 hectares, put that as a collateral in a bank, and it's very easy to access capital finance in other investments. So there's already now examples, but more importantly, there are opportunities in case corporates are interested to invest in landscape restoration and other approaches.
Okay, thank you, Charles. That was a very comprehensive answer. So now I would like to turn to Alex. You are working with, I would say, very innovative financing and other topics. So could you describe new pathways for involving corporates in financing projects at landscape level? And you focus on these questions, but there is also one question I think that you could answer after this from the audience. There is from audience is kind of asking about this, let's say, blockchain approach, and then asking that what model do you propose for validation, I guess, of this blockchain approach, and how would auditors and regulators interact with that to check the validity of the credit? So first the pathways, and then maybe about the model. Please, Alex.
Yeah, actually, I can reverse it really quickly because it's a quick answer for that second question from the audience. So that's something we're working on, and what they're asking is, how does blockchain play a role in validating projects themselves? Blockchain by itself brings transparency and trust to the projects, but as far as validating the projects themselves, what kind of models exist, I think is what the question is asking. And we're working on something there. Validators would need to be involved still, and other stakeholders. And I would recommend checking out Open Forest Protocol. They're working on a a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, which is a mouthful for those who aren't familiar with it. But yeah, I highly recommend checking out Open Forest Protocol. There are others working on this issue here, decentralizing the validation process, which could have a major impact. So, and then Petri, the second question, I think new pathways for getting corporates into financing these kinds of projects. I think that for me, from my perspective, it all revolves around trust. And I think the theme of this conversation today, given who we have on the call, is it's a trust in what's happening on the ground and the activities that are happening on the ground, the methodologies that are being used at a landscape scale to help corporates and others begin to think of these as not just projects, but as landscapes that are productive beyond carbon. And productive beyond carbon in their own supply chains, and productive plant species, and as everything that Paul and Charles have been touching on lately. But what blockchain does is it's putting trust, a layer of trust on top of that. It's technology that's allowing for transparency directly into those activities and the projects, and it's a layer of efficiency. So there will no longer be the need for some of these intermediaries at least in the carbon market and other ecosystem services markets. And those intermediaries, as we all know, carve out money that should be going back to the projects themselves, back to the investors. And they hold data. They hold data on pricing. It's very opaque, and therefore there's less confidence in transacting with these kinds of credits. And blockchain is a solution for that. It brings transparency directly to the projects, the pricing. And right now what's happening is the more we rely on these intermediaries, the more reliant we become. It's a vicious circle. And so we need to be looking for kinds of solutions like blockchain to create more efficiency, more transparency in these kinds of markets, and therefore bringing more return to these projects, which all revolves around trust. And I think that it's very important for corporates to begin to think about these projects as landscapes that are productive beyond carbon, and then begin to engage with the kinds of organizations out there that are creating the solutions layered on top of that for an added level of trust in blockchain.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Now we have some questions from the audience, and I think this is now for Paul. Robert Wust is asking, what is the main obstacle to start new landscape projects, and is it getting investors on board on the ground capacity, and how you can monitor these projects once they are going? So maybe Paul, you can address this question.
Thanks, Petri. Good question. What we're finding across our experiments around the world is a couple of key obstacles. One is the early money. It costs money to bring people together, to come up with what Edith Kiss talked about in the last session of the theory of change. You know, how does the landscape team work together to solve a problem and create an investable solution that's going to make money and produce return for investors? That's costly. That's not so cheap, and you need technical experts to do that. You know, there's plenty of people around, but connecting them in. So, you know, early money and getting that theory of change together, I think are the critical obstacles. And measuring the results, well, that's now pretty clear for carbon. I think in the last session we heard that biodiversity was a key focus for the industry, for the finance industry, and that's fantastic. But if you put 3 conservationists together in a room, you'll get 3 answers on how to measure biodiversity. So I think there's a big challenge there in the next year or two to bring a simple solution to that. There's some great advances that are starting to happen. And I think Gold Standard, WWF, and IUCN are coming together on a way of dealing with that problem. And then I wouldn't be trying to measure too much more. Obviously, it's lovely to do so, but if we can do biodiversity and carbon, where we've done a lot already. Many other things then you can tack on as you like, but that's a local question. Perhaps others can add.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I would like to ask now about, there is actually from audience, this is to Charles, about Africa. What country is doing better on landscape restoration in African continent, and how other countries could learn from it? Charles, do you have any view on this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question, and I think to add on what Paul said, restoration costs money, but more importantly, it costs the will and the awareness to be able to take action on the ground. So we have been looking at a couple of these commitments that countries have made across Africa, and recently we completed an assessment of Ethiopia. How is Ethiopia doing according to the 18 million commitments? And we have just found out that by end of 2020, Ethiopia was able to bring under restoration about 15 million hectares between 2011 and 2020. That's in 10 years. And this is span across natural regeneration of degraded mountains, to agroforestry, to woodrot plantation in the highlands, to turning degraded land into coffee plantations area, etc. So this is one case that we are looking at. And there's quite a number of investors who are also part of that movement. Another country I've also been assessing was Rwanda, which committed to restore 2 million hectares in 2011. In 2018, the country has reported already 750,000 hectares under restoration, including a natural park that was completely degraded and now is back, has been restored with indigenous species, biodiversity, really driven kind of motivation, etc. But also we have other countries, farmer managed natural regeneration in Malawi, in Niger, in countries like Ghana, where the project that Paul mentioned, the FMO is working with other organizations to really transform landscapes with plantations. This is probably not necessarily, if you look at biodiversity aspect, you may not necessarily find a lot of attractions, but from economic point of view and restoration point of view and the carbon point of view, you have those benefits also flowing from that. So I think overall there is a process of a movement really, which is being created from community farmers, smallholder farmers, to private investors, both big, small, and medium, but also to governments to really turn this degradation issue into an opportunity for investment.
Thank you, Charles. We have several questions from the audience, so I think that we try to answer these. Maybe going back to Alex now, there is a question from Rene Zettel. Does blockchain accelerate or decelerate in places in Africa where financial institutions are not systemic and mature across the continent? And does this help leapfrog? I mean, Charles can help, but maybe Alex, you can start. I don't know how well you know the African cases, but Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I can just speak to the idea, I guess, and I think that the answer is yes. That blockchain does help to leapfrog this, because how you can think of blockchain and the difference between blockchain and traditional finance institutions is, one is very bottom up. Blockchain can be designed by the stakeholders themselves, and what I mean by blockchain is I mean the different ecosystems, the systemic piece called a DAO in a lot of cases, which is an application that is a system of incentives for all of the stakeholders involved that can be a vehicle for investment. And I think that that's a really key unlocking point here for these other countries that don't have those financial institutions that are mature enough to be able to invest in these kinds of projects and see the value. And I think that blockchain does have a role to play here. And I think we're at the very beginning of having those kinds of conversations around its application. But I think that it does have an application to these countries where it's not possible to make these kinds of investments otherwise. But I'll let Charles weigh in on that too. Maybe he has some thoughts.
Charles, do you want to add something on this?
Yeah, I think I agree with Alex. There are a lot of opportunities for innovation in Africa, especially if we start talking about action at scale, because you can't just continue the small pilots all over. We need action and at scale, and action at scale calls for innovation such as blockchain. And interestingly, I also want to link this with what Paul said, is 3 breakfasts in a row in Glasgow of these banks and investors who are interested in bringing investment into landscape in Africa and globally in Asia. I think blockchain definitely presents a great innovative opportunities, because there you can easily create a very transparent way of accessing payments for millions of farmers who are engaged into large-scale restoration actions, etc. So it can easily link with the carbon market. It can easily link with financial, innovative financial access mechanism and financial flows. So I have a couple of projects actually I'm working on in Africa with my colleagues at IUCN to deploy some of the FRR blockchain in Uganda and Cameroon. So I look forward to exchanging with you, Alex, on those that we are piloting. We call them pilots, but they are opportunities for scale into this, and we can connect dots.
Hey, Charles, I think that you could answer another questions from the audience. I mean, there is an anonymous asking, theory of change has been mentioned in a number of sessions. The change wanted seems to be defined by Western-based experts or corporates to fit their targets. But what change do people on the ground in these landscapes want? I think that you are the right person to answer this question, thinking from African perspective.
But I think the definition of the problem, actually the farmer and the smallholder farmer who owns land knows better what he's suffering. He's suffering from loss of production. He's suffering from loss of the quality of his soil. He's suffering from not having enough rains. So these are the people who are the front line of the challenges we are talking about at landscape level. A farmer who have a cow and he can't access animal fodder and affects the quality of the milk and the quantity of what he harvests, etc. So those are the challenges. And I think either the private sector defining whatever they call landscapes solutions or corporates, but I think at the end of the day, the land owners have a say. And what we are seeing actually today is that farmers are becoming more and more aware of the problems they are facing, and they just need to work with those who have money to be able to fix these problems. Because as Paul said, restoration costs money, landscape action at scale costs a lot of investment. And so for me, it shouldn't be the top down, because I have money, I will tell people what to do. But it should be that I have resources, you have resources. Can we meet and sit on the table to find how we solve this problem? And this is happening, matchmaking between landowners and investors. It's happening across the continent. And I want to really, I think the person who raised the question is knocking the issue of land grabbing and sometime or those things. But I guess there's a number of opportunities we can build on in terms of best practices to challenge those malpractices, if I might say.
Okay, thank you, Charles. I would like then to jump to another question from the audience, and this is, I think Paul is in a good position to answer this. Julie Phillips is asking, from the perspective of a government-led project, what are the steps that can be taken to attract landscape finance to support the project? Maybe Paul, you.
Yeah, so they're exactly the same as they would be for an NGO leading or a corporate leading. That's how we've designed the 4 returns framework to be used by anyone in a systematic way. The good thing is that whoever kicks it off, you still have to bring all of the other players together to agree on the problem and the best solution. And once you've done that, then you can start looking for investors into your solution. So it doesn't really matter who leads it. And just to add a little bit to the answer to Anonymous, I completely agree that if the problem is defined by outsiders, you're going to fail. Maybe you'll succeed, but if it's defined locally, and you build a solution with the people in the landscapes build a solution, then it really can work. And our philosophy is landscapes first. We don't create landscape programs. People come to us with a problem and wanting help to build a solution. And I'll give you an example of what came out of that process. In the link, I've added a link to a group called Matinataki, which is a business incubation platform and investment house run by a Fijian to solve a Fijian problem, which is the disappearance of the reefs. And half of the economy of Fiji will go with it. So they've set up a system that's now reviewed 120 businesses, that has 10 investment-ready businesses for investment, and they've already purchased a whole set of waste dumps and turning them into recycling centres in Fiji. This is run by Fijians. Now we were part of that. They're now kicking us out of the ownership, and I'm quite happy about that. This should be run by Fijians for Fiji, and that's how all landscapes work. Most investment takes money from London or Switzerland or New York, puts it in the landscapes, and all of the profit comes back to London, New York, or wherever. I think we have to turn that equation around and keep the money in the landscapes to keep building society and nature.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We have another question from the audience. How effective are the current carbon standards in addressing issues at landscape approach? I cannot believe that any one of you could answer these questions. Maybe Alex, maybe you can try. Or we can. How effective are the current carbon standards in addressing issues at landscape approach? We can circulate. I mean, I know that Paul could also answer this, but maybe you have a view.
Sure, yeah. I'll be brief. I would say that I don't think that the current standards are holistically enabling these kinds of approaches to be implemented. But yeah, I'll turn it over to Paul to maybe add a little more color there.
Paul.
Yeah, we're working with Gold Standard and Vera. The landscape standard, the value chain standard are fantastic, because what they're starting to do is take it from a project approach up to the landscape scale. And the really interesting thing is Gold Standard, for instance, is going to be demanding that you deliver three sets of results, which might become credits eventually. So not only carbon, but it might be biodiversity, or it might be health, or whatever. That's the future, is an integrated package where credits might help to build a set of schools as well as invest in forests.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Then we have another, I think that we have 4 minutes left, if I'm correct, but we have another question from the audience. Do you see the landscape approach as a potential instrument to ease sustainable procurement for the FMCGs? I hope everybody knows the acronym, i.e., could a landscape provide a platform to the competing food companies to source different commodities whilst adhering to their sourcing rules? Charles, do you think that you could respond to these questions?
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm aware of time, Petri, but I think these are very good questions and can take another 2 hours to discuss. But I guess the landscape approach, what it does, it forces people to come together. And that's very, very important. It's no longer about a private company. It's no longer about a public company, or it's about players and stakeholders within a landscape. So that's what we call landscape approach. And by coming together, there is a whole interest synergies that starts being created. So either you are a food producer company or a timber or a carbon interested or a biodiversity, I think that's where we see the landscape role. And I think I didn't want to go into the details of the benefits, etc. But I think let's look at the landscape as a great opportunity to bring stakeholders on the table and be able to weigh your different interests and roles, but also increased participation and transparency in decision making, both for investments and public interest and community, etc.
Now we have to wrap up. We have only 2 minutes left. So Alex, quick takeaways.
Takeaways here is would be, I think that it's very important for corporates to be supporting and viewing these kinds of projects, no more as projects, but as landscapes. And of course, beginning to engage with blockchain solutions as a level of added transparency and trust. I think this conversation was built around trust on the ground and through these market solutions. And I think that it's important that all of us come away with that. So, yeah.
Paul, quickly.
I mean, I think it's a no-brainer for corporates to get involved in this. This is a good way of sorting out their Scope 3 emissions and addressing compliance and reducing risk and so on. If you look at it in a couple of years' time, though, it's going to be a completely different story. You know, your average consumer will be able to pick up some clothes or a chocolate bar, and do I want one that's better cotton or something like that, or do I want clothes that are also helping to reintroduce tigers back into the rainforests of Cambodia? Well, that, you know, obviously you're going to go for that. Do I want a chocolate bar that's helping to strengthen the school system of Kenya? It's a no-brainer. That's where the world's going, and landscape approach is a product that can help integrate all of those things.
Charles, we are just running out of time. Final words before
final words. I think we have a great opportunity to achieve the Paris Agreement, especially using this landscape restoration, so reversing degradation, but also investing in the climate resilient on farm. But at the same time, both corporate development partners, they have opportunity to really demonstrate action and results with using a landscape approach. So those are my final ones.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we are now running out of time. I want to thank audience, excellent questions. I'm sorry we could not answer everything. You can still contact us. I mean, you have our contacts. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Petri.
Thanks, Petri.
Everyone.